Hi, everyone. My name is Amay Latour, and I'm a staff writer on the Marquee team at Ballotpedia. Thanks for joining our discussion today on recalls. A recall is a process where voters can remove elected officials from their positions before the end of their term. Overall, 39 states allow elected officials to be recalled, and the laws governing the process vary a lot from state to state. Some states allow officials to be recalled for any reason, and others require specific reasons to do so. Ballotpedia has tracked recalls and published two recall reports a year since 2014. And our recall team finalized their mid-year report for this year on June 9th. Here to walk me through that report is Abby Smith, one of its lead authors. Thanks so much for joining me today, Abby.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So our mid-year report shows that we've tracked 164 recall efforts against 262 officials this year so far. Some recalls target several officials at a time in a single effort. So what can you tell us about those numbers? Like, how do they compare to previous years?
So those numbers are the second highest we've ever tracked. The only time we've tracked more in a mid-year report was in June of 2016, when we saw 189 recall efforts against 265 officials. That's 25 more recall efforts than we tracked in 2021, um, but only 3 more officials. In comparison, we tracked between 72 and 155 efforts by the midpoints of 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020.
Okay, and have you seen any driving forces for the high number of recalls this year?
Yes, 45 of the efforts listed in our report were in some way related to the coronavirus or government responses to the pandemic. If you subtract those, we would have only seen 119 recall efforts, which would have been the third lowest number we tracked since 2016.
Okay, that's really interesting. And since we're only halfway through this year, can we expect the number of recalls to double for 2021?
Based on data from the past 5 years, recalls were slightly more likely to start in the first half of the year rather than the second half. An average of 58% of each year's total recall efforts were initiated by our June reports, so we don't expect the numbers to fully double. In this chart, you can see the total number of recalls we ended up tracking for each entire year. You can see how high this year's numbers are when you see that we've already surpassed 2 years, 2019 and 2013, and it's only June. We talked about 2016 earlier. You can see in the chart that those 189 efforts from the mid-year report went on to become a total of 282 efforts for the whole year. That was the highest number of recalls we've ever tracked. If the pace from prior years holds for 2021, we project that this year we will see a total of 283 recall efforts by the end of the year. So we could surpass our highest year.
All right, thanks. So let's dig into this year's recall efforts a bit more. The report shows that school board members drew more recall petitions than any other group in the first half of 2021. Is that typical?
This was actually the first time since 2015 that they've accounted for the most recall efforts. City council members took the top spot in our mid-year reports from 2016 to 2020. In that 5-year span, an average of 76 city council members were named in recall efforts as of the midway point each year. You can see in this chart that we're below that average with 66 this year. In comparison, an average of 33 school board members were named in recalls in that same time period. So this year's 126 members is very high.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you mentioned the pandemic earlier as a driving force behind recall efforts this year. Is that what is behind the high number of efforts targeting school board members as well?
Yes, as you can see in this chart, we are currently at an all-time high for school board recalls, and it's only June. The other numbers on this chart are for the entire year. Out of the 50 total school board recall efforts we've tracked so far in 2021, 31 have been related to the pandemic in some way. That's 62%. If we took away those 31, we'd be left with 19 efforts this year. That would still be high for an odd numbered year. In 2017, we tracked a total of 18 recall efforts for the entire year. And in 2019, we tracked a total of 20. But we wouldn't be at the all-time high we have right now. And again, it's only June.
Right. And you mentioned earlier 45 efforts tracked in this report for this year were related to the coronavirus pandemic. That means school boards accounted for most of those. Is that right?
Yes. School board decisions on in-person schooling was the main reason listed in recall petitions related to the pandemic. School board recalls accounted for 31 of the 45 recall efforts we've tracked that are related in some way to COVID-19. That's 69%. Next up were city council members, which accounted for 8 of the COVID-related recalls, or 18%. Mayors accounted for 7, or 16%.
Okay, well, thank you for that breakdown, Abby. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about where these recalls are happening. Tell me about California. The recall report said it had the most officials named in recall efforts for the 5th time in 6 years.
Yes, it is not uncommon for California to have the largest portion of officials included in recall efforts, but this year was also higher than the average. As of June 9th, we tracked recalls against 78 officials in the state. The average number of officials included in recall efforts in California at the midway point from 2016 to 2020 was 43. Part of the reason for the high number of recalls in California is the large population, but the other part is the state's recall laws. California does not require a specific set of grounds for a recall. That means citizens can start a recall for any reason, as long as they use the correct paperwork, formatting, and collect enough signatures.
Okay, so what about the states that saw the 2nd and 3rd most officials targeted in 2021? That was Arizona and Washington. Are they usually at the top?
Arizona saw 32 officials included in recall efforts this year, putting it in 2nd place. This was the 2nd time the state had been in the top 3 of our mid-year reports. It had the 3rd highest number of officials included in recall efforts in the June 2018 report. Outside of that, Arizona tends to land in the 5th to 10th place range in our reports, so it's not far out of its norm this year. As for Washington, it has never been in the top 3 before. Prior to 2021, the 5-year average for the state was 4 officials as of the mid-year report. This year's 20 officials was very high for the state. Those 20 officials were part of 9 separate recall efforts. One recall effort was against Washington Governor Jay Inslee. Another 3 were against county sheriffs, and 1 was against a Seattle City Council member. Another 3 efforts were against a total of 15 school board members.
Okay, and are there any states that tend to make the top 3 but did not this year?
When looking back at other mid-year reports, both Michigan and Colorado appeared in the top 3 multiple times. After California, Michigan was in the top 3 the most with 4 reports, and Colorado came next with 3. This year, Michigan and Colorado tied for 4th place with recalls against 17 officials, so they didn't fall far down the list.
All right, and the report also looked at recalls by state per 100,000 residents. What did that show?
When looking at recalls by the number of residents, California fell to 10th place with 0.11 recalls per 100,000 residents. Alaska took the lead with 0.55. Nebraska and Idaho came next with 0.41 and 0.33 respectively. We started looking at recalls by population in 2018, so I only have 3 other years to compare to. North Dakota took the top spot in 2020 and 2018, and Idaho took the top spot in 2019.
Okay, and what is the status of recalls this year? With more recall efforts than we've seen recently, does that mean that more are actually making the ballot?
At this point in the year, the majority of recalls are still underway. That means they are still in the process of collecting signatures or are waiting for election agencies to approve petitions. Recall efforts against 149 of the 262 officials we tracked are underway, which is 57%. Another 9 recalls made the ballot, but the elections haven't taken place yet. The others fall into 4 categories, which you can see in this chart. The first 2 are for recalls that made the ballot and the elections have already taken place. So, removed from office means the recall election was approved by voters and the official lost their position. 9 officials are in that category so far this year. Defeated means the recall election was rejected by voters. A majority voted to keep the official in office. 12 officials are in that category so far this year.
Okay, and how about those other 2 categories included in the chart?
Sure. So the one that has the largest number of officials is did not make the ballot. That could mean the effort did not collect enough signatures by the deadline, or the petitions were rejected because they did not meet the specific grounds for recall required by the state. It might also mean the efforts were abandoned or that not enough of the signatures that were submitted were verified by an election agency. The fourth category is resigned. That means the official included in the recall effort resigned from their position. The official may not cite a recall effort directly in their resignation letter, but if they resigned after a petition was started against them, we count it in this category.
Okay, great. So just to recap, recall elections against 9 officials are scheduled but haven't taken place yet. Recalls against another 9 resulted in the official being removed, and recalls against 12 officials were defeated. That's a total of 30 officials who have been put on a recall ballot, or 11% of the total facing recall efforts. So how does that compare to past years?
Compared to mid-year recall reports from 2016 to 2020, a higher percentage of recalls are still underway this year, and a lower percentage has made it to the ballot. As I said earlier, 57% of recalls we've tracked this year are still underway. From June 2016 to June 2020, we saw between 36 and 51% still underway. During the same time period, we saw between 17 and 26% make the ballot, which is higher than the 11% we've seen so far this year. Recalls have also been less successful in terms of removing officials from office this year. Officials being removed from office in recall elections accounted for 3% of the recalls we tracked, while we saw between 10 and 15% at the mid-year point from 2016 to 2020.
All right, well, thanks, Abby. Let's end our discussion today on notable recalls. The report lists 5 recalls that have gotten a lot of attention, with the effort against California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom at the top of that list. So can you tell us a bit more about those efforts?
Yes, the Newsom recall actually had a deadline pass yesterday, but I'll give you some background information first. Organizers of the Newsom recall needed to submit nearly 1,500,000 signatures by March 17th to move the recall forward. They submitted 2.1 million signatures, and the California Secretary of State found more than 1,700,000 were valid. Voters who signed the petition had until June 8th to request removal from the petition, and the Secretary of State had until yesterday to verify that enough signatures remained. I didn't see an update on that by the time this briefing started. If enough signatures do remain, the recall will be certified and moved to a budgeting and scheduling phase. Recall supporters said Newsom mishandled the state's response to the coronavirus pandemic, did not do enough to address the state's homelessness rate, and supported sanctuary city policies and water rationing. Newsom called the effort a, and I quote, Republican recall backed by the RNC, anti-mask and anti-vax extremists, and pro-Trump forces who want to overturn the last election and have opposed much of what we have done to fight the pandemic.
Yeah, we've been following this effort pretty closely on the Marquee team. Can you briefly tell us about the other efforts your team is tracking?
Sure. The other notable efforts include two separate efforts against Republican Mark Finchem, who is a member of the Arizona House of Representatives. The efforts claim Finchem spread voter fraud conspiracy theories about the 2020 presidential race and was involved in the January 6th breach of the US Capitol. Finchem acknowledged that he attended the Stop and Steal rally that preceded the breach of the US Capitol, but denied that he participated in the violence. There are also two recall efforts against California district attorneys in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Both officials said they are trying to reform the criminal justice system in their cities. There's also an effort against 6 of the 9 members of the Loudoun County School District in Virginia. Recall supporters alleged that the district was using critical race theory in its employee training and student curriculum. The district denied that allegation.
All right, well, this has been a ton of information about a type of election we don't hear as much about, but as we can see, there are plenty of them each year, and it's been great to just take some time today to learn more about them. So Abby, thank you for being here and sharing all this information from the MidYear Report.
My pleasure.
So just before we sign off, we did invite readers to submit some questions ahead of today's call. Here's one on recall laws. Abby, how many states require specific grounds for recalls?
A total of 39 states allow for the recall of elected officials. And of those 39, 12 states require specific grounds for recall. Those 12 states are Alaska, Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, New Mexico, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Virginia, and Washington. Some examples of the grounds that need to be met in those states are acts of malfeasance or misfeasance while in office, violating an oath of office, neglect of duty, crimes in office, gross incompetence, physical or mental lack of fitness, and corruption.
All right, great, thanks for that. I've got one more question for you. We've discussed how one recall effort can be against multiple officials. What is the average number of officials targeted per recall per year?
There can also be multiple recall efforts against the same official. That's common at the state executive level. For example, we've tracked 11 separate recall efforts against the governor of Michigan this year. Single recall efforts against multiple officials are usually against members of city councils, school boards, or county commissions. It is not uncommon for a recall group to target a majority voting block on an elected board, or to target a certain number of seats on a board in order to gain or change a board majority. I have also seen single recall efforts against entire boards. We've tracked 3 recall efforts this year that include all 5 members of a school board. The highest number of officials named in one recall effort that we've seen this year was 7, which was the entire city council of Red Wing, Minnesota. Overall, between 2016 and 2020, we saw an average of 1.38 officials targeted per recall. The low was 1.25 in 2020, and the high was 1.52 in 2019. This year's June recall report was high compared to those. We've seen an average of 1.6 officials targeted per recall so far this year.
Well, thanks again for all this information and for taking those questions.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I also want to thank Kayla Harris, our Senior Communications Associate, for the presentation that was part of today's briefing. And thanks, of course, to everyone for listening. If you are attending this Zoom call, you'll receive a YouTube link tomorrow with a recording of today's call, along with a link to the full mid-year recall report that we've been discussing. I hope you've enjoyed this look at that report. And this is, just one example of the type of work Ballotpedia does related to elections, government, and policy. And we rely largely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and you want to support us, please do consider donating. You can do so at ballotpedia.org/donate. And to stay connected with us, you can visit our homepage, ballotpedia.org, where you can find the latest political news along with links to our major coverage areas. You can also sign up for one of our many newsletters, which cover topics from election policy to the federal courts, or a mix of all the latest news across our coverage areas in newsletters like the Daily Brew and the Tap. Have a great day, and thanks for watching, everyone.